Model of therapy that we're going to talk about here today is feminist therapy. And feminist therapy is somewhat different from many of the other models that we've discussed. Probably when I think about it, it's most similar to existential therapy in that whereas many of the models really have sort of a therapy which follows from their conceptual understanding of human behavior, which involves a variety of tools or techniques or something. So if you look at reality therapy and needs in the Wadette model, or cognitive therapy with looking at cognitions, or psychoanalysis and having people lie on a couch and talk about early experiences and analyzing the transference and things like that, Gestalt therapy, they have, when you think about them, you think about this is what it is and sort of this is how I would do it. Again, somewhat similar to existential, where existential is kind of a perspective on people or issues, or helping people to find a sense of meaning and purpose in their life and experiences. Feminist therapy also is a perspective kind of model. And most anywhere that you would read about the doing of feminist therapy, as you will in the Scharf book for this class, people really they don't focus on there's one practitioner who founded feminist theory/therapy and this is what he or she has clients do. They talk about there's a feminist perspective on life, and so we're going to talk about some of the components of that. And then what people do is they take the ideology, the sort of lens, the feminist perspective, the way that you view the world, and they incorporate that with a variety of tools and techniques from other therapeutic orientations, changing them subtly, perhaps, and in kind of predictable ways. But so you could have a cognitive feminist therapist. That would be a therapist who has a feminist perspective on reality, on how men and women develop, on different issues, and yet really works on people in terms of how they think about things and what they tell themselves about things, and helping them learn new skills and behaviors. You could have a feminist psychoanalyst, which some people think is an oxymoron. But you'll read in the chapter about what feminism sort of adds to psychoanalysis and what it likes to modify from psychoanalysis, and how it would put those two models together. So it's not really a way of doing things, it's a way of seeing things, it's a way to help people understand the world and understand themselves and their place in the world. And it's much more of a sort of politically activating, generating kind of model than most of the others, which are dealing specifically with the individual person. So kind of with that as an overarching framework, let's go through some of the specific details on this model. This is an approach which really didn't get its start until the 1970s and really doesn't have at its heart, the founder or founders. It's a model where a lot of people have made contributions to the field. The name Chodorow, the name Gilligan are names which will come up, but they're not therapists who've been practicing in this for a long time, the way that Albert Ellis is attributed to rational emotive therapy, and Aaron Beck with cognitive therapy, and Bill Glasser with reality therapy, and Sigmund Freud with psychoanalysis. This doesn't really have a clear figure who's in charge. Now, again, if you look historically, feminist therapy, which took off pretty much starting in the 1970s in the United States, historically the 1970s were right there at the major push and run of the women's movement. Coming out of the 1960s, civil rights issues for people of color, issues for women were really kind of at the forefront. And so this model developed out of the feminist movement, which you could attribute probably back to beginning in the 1950s and then slowly growing through the 60s into the 1970s. So that's kind of where it got its start. And when it started, it was predominantly looking at issues of gender and the woman's experience in the world. However, it's been broadened, and one of the criticisms that it took a few years out was that it focused specifically, or most specifically, on women's issues, and almost to an extent on white women's issues. And women of color were saying, we might actually like to have the privilege of suffering from some of the troubles that white women have. we believe this model needs to be broader. It needs to take in experiences for people of color, and it needs to appreciate that some of the differences or the experiences that Black women have are similar to white women's issues, but some are different, and some issues Hispanic women have are similar to white women's issues, but are different. So the model has kind of grown from being feminist, meaning issues pertaining to and only about women, to gender, to now this kind of model of therapy which really looks at how power is used and the privileges which come with power and what it's like to have it and what it's like not to have it, and the ways that sort of being a privileged class or privileged group might have an influence on one's reality and on one's sense of how we relate to others. And some of that is gender, some of that is race, some of that is sexual orientation. And so feminist therapy really kind of looks at all of those issues very much at its core, whereas a lot of the other models will say, oh yes, and then if you have, you know, clients of a different culture, or you have gay and lesbian clients, you can use the model, or you might look at it this way. But this model really kind of incorporates this at the heart of it. This is a model which not only looks at therapy and looks at individuals, but really looks at socio-political forces and their influence. So, and it's kind of the first thing I have here written down is that it looks at sociological and political forces as well as individual factors. So that if you have a client who comes in and is complaining about symptoms, in some of the models you work with the symptom. In behaviorism was challenged and people had some troubles with it early on. They saw it purely as a symptom-focused model. Psychoanalysis will go beyond the symptom. So if behaviorism, I'm smoking a cigarette, my symptom is cigarette smoking and perhaps coughing and chronic bronchitis or something, you help the person to quit smoking, life goes on. The analyst might say, smoking. This is an oral fixation. This is someone who probably had troubles with, you know, mom and the breast or the bottle at an early age, but the smoking is a symptom of a deeper underlying conflict which took place at the earliest stage of development, the oral phase. Now, feminists would say, smoking. Let's look at this, and this is not a big issue that feminists look at, but nonetheless, let's look at the socio-political forces that surround smoking. Well, if we look at our culture today, we find that, geez, there's a lot of advertising, much though the cigarette companies may claim that they're not to be, aimed at helping kids to think smoking might be a cool habit. Do these ads happen to pertain more to girls than to boys? Some people say smoking is attributed to thinness. Thinness is a big thing in our culture, probably more so for girls than boys. So it would look at gender differences. If you go through and you look at where cigarette ads are they placed in upper class neighborhoods, are they placed in working class neighborhoods, are they placed in poor neighborhoods? Are they culturally specific? All that kind of stuff would be, the smoking is not just the habit as the behaviors would say, maybe not just the inner conflict that the analysts would say, but there's a whole socio-political, you know, bunch of advertising people out there marketing cigarettes. That's a big picture. Socio-political issues which feminist therapists are much more likely to pick up than something like smoking. Domestic violence. Violence is seen as being an individual issue. Is violence seen as being a family issue? Is violence seen as being a product of growing up in a patriarchal society where it's okay for some people to be bigger, tougher, stronger, and other people to be smaller and weaker, and to keep them in their place by physical means or means of sort of mind control, psychological tactics and so forth like that. If you look at issues of body image, women tend to be more marketed to in terms of to be attractive, to be thin, one must wear makeup and have one's hair done and so forth. If a teenage girl comes in and she doesn't feel like her life is going where she wants it to, and she doesn't have a boyfriend and she feels very badly, is this different for her than if a teenage boy comes in? Is she more a product of her social environment, which says more to a girl, it's important to be pretty, it's important to be thin, it's important to have a boyfriend, you're going to grow up and get married and raise babies, than to a boy where the culture may say, be strong, be tough, be individual, go out, make money, be supportive, that, you know, make the world a better place. Are those messages that our kids are getting? Certainly we would say probably less gender stereotypes today than they might have been 20, 30 years ago. Are those still messages, and how does this affect people? How does that affect the boy? How does that affect the girl? Feminist therapy is a model which will really kind of look at these bigger, broader things. So it helps people to seek change in their life rather than simply adaptation to circumstances. Now, to a certain extent, almost any therapy model will do this, with the exception of perhaps medication, although even medications often seek to help give people sort of the biological boost they need in order to bring their life into a better place so that hopefully they can make better decisions, they can think differently, they can act differently, they can have healthier relationships, and maybe the need for meds can drop out. But feminist therapy really goes for, let's try to make a change, and not only a change in your personal behavior, your personal attitude and outlook, your self-talk, your emotions, but a change in the broader world, a change in how the world is and how the world treats people, particularly people who may be not in the power structure. So this idea that the personal is political and the political is personal, that if a woman comes in and she is being beaten by her husband, this is very much a family issue, this is very much a personal issue, and while a behavior therapist, a cognitive therapist, a reality therapist, an existential therapist will all help the woman to sort of probably gather strength within herself to either change the relationship or get out of the relationship, to help her grow and develop to be more strong emotionally for herself and perhaps for her children, to develop a new life and healthier relationships. The feminist model is a model which is more likely to say, and now that you're stronger in yourself, look around at this society, look around at the culture which sort of perpetuates domestic violence. Is it merely perpetuated, or are there actually things in our culture which promote domestic violence? Are there institutions? Are there values? Are there, are there just social forces which not only enable this, but perhaps even push it along? And are there things that you as a client can do in order to try to change this? One of the areas where a lot of these issues kind of took on a life and started becoming sort of out in the public and noticed and so forth was in the 60s and the 70s and through today in feminist therapy, but particularly through the 60s and 70s. There were consciousness raising groups where women would get together and really start paying attention to, it's not just me. There are things which are endemic in our culture which lead to some of the issues that people are facing. And these are, there's issues of, the current statistic is women make, I think, 73 cents out of every dollar that a man makes for a comparable job. Well, so if a woman is experiencing poverty, is that her personal failure or shortcoming, or is that a social thing that she makes 73 cents at the same job as a man would make? And there are a variety of different reasons and explanations for that, but nonetheless, I think that's about where the statistic is. So is this a personal thing, or is this a bigger, broader political issue? And where does my responsibility stop? Does it stop to myself? I'm making enough money to be comfortable in my family, or do I have some responsibility? If we talk about Alfred Adler, is there a social interest issue here? Do I need to try to help make the world a better place? If I'm someone of color and I realize that people are discriminated against who are of my race, do I not only have a responsibility to myself and my family, but also to help other members of my race to have better opportunities, to be treated more equally, to be seen on a level playing field? And so that's some of the issues that feminist therapy looks at. Now, if we go to just sort of how we look at an individual developing, the feminists have a lens that they will put on gender role developmentally to help appreciate that while girls and boys, you could even have twins, fraternal twins where brother and sister share mom's womb together at the same time, are born minutes apart from each other. do those kids raised in the same family by the same mom and dad, do they grow up in the same world? Or do they grow up in two very different worlds? The little girl child grows up in the girl world, and the boy child grows up in the boy world. And so some of the studies that feminist therapists will look to help understand how sort of culture and gender and political issues affect us as individual people are studies which have followed people through different developmental periods. If you look at childhood, there's a lot of research done in the late 60s late 60s and 70s, back when there was a time when people really sort of honestly believed that every baby was born pretty much equal and that all gender role happened to develop environmentally. Now, people of the year 2004, there's been a lot of research over the last 2 decades showing differences which appear to be clearly biological differences other than simply genital anatomy. Biological differences in people's brain development and so forth, which say biologically men and women are different, and the biology is one of the things which probably leads us on separate paths. But there's also a lot of research which shows that in addition to biology, social forces lead us down slightly different paths. So that if you look in the average family, little boy twin, little girl twin, it's quite probable that they will not go home from the hospital in the same color clothes. That the little girl will go home in pink and the little boy will go home in blue. And that if they have a baby shower, they will have different gifts. And that when grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles bring those kids toys, they will bring them different kinds of toys. The little girls will have nurturing toys and the little boys will have much more sort of, zoom, car, truck, bouncing ball, tough kinds of toys. Once you get kids through toddlerhood, where immediate family may or may not raise them differently, and certainly some families raise kids in much more gender stereotypical roles, and other families really are very much more egalitarian, where the girls get army trucks and the boys get Barbie dolls every bit as much as the other way around. By the time those kids are about 3 or 4, if they go to preschool, it is very likely that preschool has a structure in which boys are treated one way and girls are treated another. I was amazed when my son was a couple months shy of 3, and we enrolled him in a local preschool, and the teacher had the kids line up for lunch. The boys were in this row, and the girls were in this row. When you got to school in the morning, the door opened up, and the boys were in this line, and the girls were in this line. When they walked places, the girls were here, and the boys were here. 3-year-old kids. And yet kids start differentiating pretty quickly that girls do these things and boys do those things. By the time kids go to grade school, little boys and little girls tend to play in gender stratified playgroups. And if a little boy plays with the girls, he may be picked on for being a sissy or being kind of weird. If a girl plays with the boys, then being a tomboy is probably more cool than being a boy who's a sissy. But girls tend to play more with girls, boys tend to play more with boys, and by the time my son was in kindergarten, he didn't want to have friends who were girls anymore, even though in preschool he just had great friends who were little girls. But by the time he was in kindergarten age, he was old enough to know this was not a cool boy thing to do. Girls were icky and girls were to be avoided. And that's not at all atypical. So through early childhood, there are definite messages that our culture brings to children. In adolescence, this is when puberty hits. This is when people's sexuality begins blossoming. And sex roles really start, sexuality and sex roles start coming in. This is where marketing really caters very heavily to teenage girls and, issues of clothing, issues of makeup, issues of thinness and attraction and how to get a boyfriend and how to be attractive really start playing heavily into female development. Boys have their own kind of, be tough, be strong, be manly images, but they're different images from what girls experience. So again, people continue down separate paths through adolescence. Adolescence is where eating disorders in girls often arise. Now that's not to say they don't happen in boys, and there's more evidence that they're probably more common than we had thought, particularly among kids who play sports like wrestling or something where weight is important for the sport. but it's probably still a bigger issue among girls. The stats tend to run about 9 to 1, girls to boys, for serious eating disorders like bulimia or anorexia. As people enter adulthood, oftentimes in early adulthood, there may be some gender differences. Today we're fairly equalized in terms of going to college, and actually I believe in recent years, female enrollment into colleges and even some schools of higher education, postgraduate education, women are starting to outnumber men in a number of fields, which is a flip-flop from how it was a generation ago. Once people begin getting married or start entering marriageable age, there still appears to be more pressure on women to marry, to find a male partner, to marry, and to have children, than for men, for whom it seems to be more of, it's still certainly a cultural expectation, but men don't seem to experience the pressure, and the pressure from family and the pressure from friends of, oh my goodness, you're 30 and you don't have kids yet, or you're not wanting to have kids. So the pressure to start the next generation becomes strong, perhaps for both genders, but especially for women. And often once children are born into a new family, you start seeing the sex roles where one person has to take off time from work in order to at least take care of an early baby, and if someone cuts down work or stops working in order to stay home and raise kids, although men are doing that more today, women still shoulder the great responsibility for early child care. If you have parents who call in sick when they have a sick child, much more often than not it's mom who takes the day off rather than dad who takes the day off. And there's a phrase called the mommy track, which is that if two people graduate from college and they both start a career track and they're both moving up equally, and then they start having children, dad very often moves up much more quickly and mom kind of holds her up much more slowly. That's the mommy track. The mommy track is I cut down to part-time. The mommy track is I take off holidays. The mommy track is I'm the one who takes off for the PTA meetings, and I'm the one who takes off when the children are sick, and give up promotions and gives up staying late and making extra money and so forth in order to stay home and raise children, which is a lovely, wonderful thing to do. But it's not shared equally by genders. It tends to be shouldered much more. Moms choose to do that and dads choose not to. So feminist therapy really looks at how do these different ways of being raised in our culture influence clients, influence clients' well-being, influence clients' stresses, influence the issues that female therapists bring to the session, or female clients bring, influence what male clients bring. If you have a man who really wants to stay home and raise children, and when my son was in preschool, there were two dads who were the primary caregivers. They stayed home and their wives worked full-time. They would talk about how, it's weird. You go to events and there's 20 mothers and you. There's mom's sort of, mommy and baby time. There's not dad and baby time. The dads would go grocery shopping during the day and it would be all the moms and kids. And then, this is a cultural thing, and a stay-at-home dad is seen as much more unusual than a stay-at-home mom, which is still pretty darn normal. So it's not a 50-50 thing, and this has an influence on people of both sexes. And again, this is something that people look at. Moral development. The very well-known Kohlberg studies on how people develop morally. The studies were done primarily with boy children. And when the research came out, in a number of cases it showed that boys seem to be more morally developed or to achieve higher levels of moral development than do girls. And if you look at Freud, if you go back and read some of a more in-depth analysis of Freud than what my lecture and the textbook talk about, in the resolution of the Oedipus complex, that's seen as being slightly different from the resolution of the Electra complex, which may be an explanation of how boys develop superior morality, because of this whole castration anxiety stuff that those of you who are interested can read about in more detail. Well, Kohlberg could use this idea of castration anxiety and Freudian development as to why boys tended to score slightly higher on his tests than did girls. Well, Carol Gilligan came along and she said, I don't think this has anything to do with that men are more superior morally, or boys are, than are girls. I think they developed along separate tracks. What Gilligan proposed was that men, and the kind of scale that Kohlberg used, develop a sense of justice, a sense of individuality, a sense of what is right and wrong against a standard, and that's how they develop morally. Girls, on the other hand, develop more a relational sense of morality. And so for them, rather than some sort of outside sense of justice, some sense of rightness and wrongness, girls develop this sense of, is this fair? Does this hurt me? Does this hurt you? Is everybody happy? So kind of a taking care of other people's thoughts, feelings, opinions, and so forth. Making sure everybody in the group is okay and nobody's left out or nobody's toes have been stepped on or something like that. So Gilligan did a number of studies looking at boys and girls in different kinds of situations and sort of developed a separate but equal explanation of moral development, that it's not that boys develop better or worse or girls develop better or worse. It's just different. This sort of moves into this idea, some people have studied the communication styles of men and women. And there were a number of books that were published in the, I believe it was the 80s. Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus was a kind of schlocky one that came out. There are some more scholarly books as well that look at how men and women relate. And there's a brief piece in the text which talks about this. If you look at the language that people use in talking, either cross-gender talking, men talking with women, or men talking with men and women talking with women, if women are talking with someone, we're much more likely, if somebody's telling a story, to join the conversation by saying, gosh, something like that happened to me too, and tell the story, or say, oh, that must have really made you feel sad, or gosh, I'd be angry if my teacher or my boyfriend or my so-and-so did that to me too. We connect on an emotional level, we connect on a relational level. Men are much more likely, and people will describe it as relating on a power level. And that's if someone comes in and talks about, I just had this problem with my kid, this problem with my boss, then they'll say, well, tell me what happened. And you tell them what happened, and say, well, have you tried this? Oh gosh, no, I didn't try. I really think you should try to do this. This might, take care of the situation. So men are much more sort of action-oriented in terms of if women are thinking about the feelings in order to relate, men are talking about the actions. What is it that you could do? Making suggestions, offering alternatives and solutions. And people see this as perhaps being a little bit more of a power kind of thing. I have something that I can offer to you to make your life a little bit better, a little bit happier, and so forth. And I personally, after doing some of these readings, have sat back and kind of watched people of different genders relate. And my personal experience says that this is accurate, certainly not 100% of the time, but it really is fairly descriptive. There's also a literature on how women and men look at one another when they talk, and how men are much more likely to make eye contact with women and women when they're talking, and women to sort of look down at the ground when they're talking, and just different ways of measuring power in relationships when people are communicating with one another. The idea of gender schemas is another idea which comes up. In a gender schema, a schema is kind of the lens through which you view the world. So if I have a gender schema, which is a very gender, sex, stereotypical schema, women are feminine, they're nurturing, they're concerned about taking care of others, they like to be physically attractive and appealing to people, they raise children, they cook, they keep homes clean. Men are strong, they're caretakers, they're providers, they make money, they're involved in things like sports and competitive activities. That's how I view situations. So if I take this idea in my head, this is the lens through which I view the world, and I go over and I look out the window and I just see a bunch of people playing soccer. And then a friend of mine comes in and says, what are you watching? And I say, I'm looking out the window and there's a bunch of, fill in the blank, playing soccer. I'm much more likely to say, there's a bunch of guys playing soccer. Because playing soccer sort of fits in my, this is something guys do. If I walk into a room and someone's cooking, and I just see them from the back, and let's say they have hair about as long as mine from the back, I'm very likely to automatically think that that's a woman. Now, it could be a guy with hair the same length as mine. But because my schema is women are people who cook, I I go in and I see a gender-neutral person from the back cooking, and automatically I make the assumption that this must be a woman. Now the person turns around, has a full beard, and is a very kind of, macho-looking guy, and I'm very surprised. This shocks my gender schema. It doesn't make sense in my world, and I have to do something to make sense of it. So therapists will also kind of look at how it is that people view the world, and will see how that influences their relationships with members of the opposite sex, how they view things, their expectations of themselves, their expectations of others. If we move to the specific therapy that you take kind of all of this picture, so these are the lenses, this is the worldview that people bring as they are feminist therapists into working with people. So what do they do in a session? One of the things that you do in a session is you often come in with another theoretical orientation that gives you some of the tools and techniques and tricks of the trade. And pretty much anything I've read on feminist therapy says that you will combine it, and I talked about that in the beginning of the lecture. You'll look and listen for socio-political issues, and will encourage clients to make a difference in the world, not only in their own lives. It's not a mandate, but oftentimes people will look at socio-political influences, how this affects what's going on with the client, and then they encourage the client to actually do some consciousness raising or go out in the world and try to change the actual things which are affecting them. The feminist therapists really, really talk about and value an open egalitarian relationship. They very much don't like therapeutic relationships where it is the therapist and the client, where the therapist is in this sort of a position of authority and an expert, and the client is this person who comes and says, please bestow your knowledge and wisdom and your kindness and nurturance upon me so that I may be a better person. It really tries to be a relationship between two equals, where it's one person sort of coming for a consultation with another person who may be able to help them look at things differently, to act differently, to interface the world in a more effective fashion. Feminist therapists appreciate the female experience in life. They also appreciate the experience of sort of being perhaps the underdog, or being the person who's not in the power structure, whether that's being female, whether that's being a person of color, whether that's being gay or lesbian, but really to kind of appreciate how this issue of power shakes down and affects how people get along in the world. In terms of what people will work on in feminist therapy, very much a client could come in with any issue that you would come in another treatment modality, and you work with them on it using often, as it says there, the feminist perspective with the model, that the other sort of doing model that you would work with. A common thing that feminist therapists may help clients to do is work on assertiveness. Assertiveness training is something where you help people not to be passive. Passive is you let others run over you. Not to be aggressive, which is my rights supersede your rights, but to have an equal relationship where my rights are of value, your rights are of value. How can we work out some sort of compromise, or how can we work out a win-win kind of situation? And another thing which you can work on with clients is called a gender role analysis. And a gender role analysis is where you help people kind of really understand the roles and the schemas which they have, how this influences what it is that they do. Do they want to continue to hold that view? If they don't, can they change it, and how will they change it, and how does that impact their life? So that if you come in and you're a very traditional feminist, or very traditionally feminine woman, and you're in a position and you're just feeling sad and down and depressed, and maybe that's because in your relationship with your husband you have very little or almost no power, but this is kind of the way that grandma socialized mom and mom has socialized you, but you're not so sure that this is what's right for you and this is what makes you happy. Well, the therapist would help you to first of all understand that this is sort of a belief, a schema that you brought with you, would help you to identify that, would help you to say, well, this is a gender stereotype. Do you want to keep this? Or would you like to give it up? If you'd like to give it up, what could you do? Which is different? How would you act differently? and then to start practicing living that way, as if, you know, the power is equalizing, and the gender role schema is more, this is a marriage, the two of us are equal partners, and we will provide maybe different strengths and bring different things to the relationship, but both of us contribute equally and should share equally in terms of the good things which come out of the relationship. Anyway, that's about what I have to say on feminist therapy.